She gave him 20 years, 4 children, and her entire youth. But when he traded her in for a younger woman and tried to erase her like a stain, Betty Broderick didn't just break. She exploded. And on a quiet November morning, she walked into their bedroom with a loaded gun and made sure no one would ever forget her name. The morning of November 5th, 1989, was eerily quiet in San Diego's upscale Marston Hills neighborhood. The sun had not yet broken over the city when a single act of violence would stain its stillness forever. Inside a stately Spanish-style home on Cypress Street, 2 people lay asleep, unaware that their past was about to come crashing through the bedroom door. Betty Broderick, a woman once seen as a suburban ideal of wife and mother, would soon become a symbol of betrayal, rage, and irreversible consequence. Betty had once lived in a world that looked perfect from the outside. Born Elizabeth Ann Bisaglia, she came from a devout Catholic family in Bronxville, New York. Her upbringing was disciplined but warm, rooted in values of loyalty, family, and perseverance. She met Daniel Broderick at a party in South Bend, Indiana, in 1965. He was tall, ambitious, and a medical student at Notre Dame. She was instantly drawn to his intelligence and quiet confidence. Within a short time, they married and moved to the East Coast, chasing Dan's academic and professional dreams. For nearly 2 decades, Betty supported Dan through not just 1, but 2 advanced degrees, medicine and law. She worked as a schoolteacher, then sold Tupperware and Avon to keep food on the table while Dan attended Harvard. She gave birth to 5 children, one of whom tragically died shortly after birth, and raised the remaining 4 largely on her own while Dan worked long hours. Through each move and sacrifice, she believed she was building a life with a man she trusted. A man she loved with every fiber of her being. Dan finally made good on his promise of success. By the 1980s, he had become one of the most prominent medical malpractice attorneys in San Diego, earning millions and securing the lifestyle they had once only dreamed about. A sprawling home in La Jolla, memberships at exclusive country clubs, fancy dinners, private schools, family vacations. Betty believed she had earned that life. She had paid for it with years of emotional labor, lonely nights, and forgotten dreams. But things began to shift. Dan grew distant, more consumed by his work, colder in his conversations. He hired a bright, 21-year-old legal assistant named Linda Colkina, blonde, youthful, and energetic. Betty's intuition flared like an alarm bell. She questioned Dan, accused him of having an affair. He denied it repeatedly, sometimes even laughing at her suspicions. He insisted Linda was just a secretary, but Betty knew. She could feel it in her bones. The lie persisted for years. Dan continued to gaslight her, telling her she was paranoid, jealous, and unstable. But in 1985, he moved out. That silent move marked the beginning of a 5-year psychological war, not just a divorce, but an all-out emotional siege. Dan filed for legal separation, hired himself as his own attorney, and manipulated every legal advantage to his favor. Betty was left in a limbo of technicalities and financial control. Her access to money was restricted. Her credit was cut off. Her mental health unraveled, day by day. Betty's behavior became erratic. She left profane voicemails on Dan's answering machine, sometimes dozens a day. She spray-painted his property. She drove her car into his front door. And each outburst was used against her in court, reinforcing Dan's claim that she was unstable and dangerous. To the legal system, she appeared to be an unhinged woman, unable to accept the end of her marriage. But to Betty, she was a prisoner of betrayal, abandoned after 20 years of loyalty, replaced by a younger model, and then punished for reacting with outrage. Dan and Linda continued their relationship openly now. They lived together in a new house, one Betty had once imagined as her retirement dream. Her children were often at Dan's house. With Linda, with her decorations, with her new routines, Betty seethed. She began keeping journals, long entries filled with rage, grief, and disjointed thoughts. Her friends tried to comfort her, but few understood the depth of her emotional wound. In 1989, Dan married Linda. The ceremony was opulent and well-attended, held in the very social circles Betty had once ruled. That wedding wasn't just a union. It was a declaration. Linda wasn't a mistress anymore. She was Mrs. Broderick, and Betty was officially obsolete. The invitation had never come. The children went anyway, and Betty was left sitting alone in her house, staring at the ceiling, wondering what she had become. The rage had been building for years, and on that cold November morning, it finally spilled over. Betty took a .38 caliber revolver she had obtained earlier in the year, supposedly for protection, and drove to Dan's house. She used a key she had taken from her daughter to enter. She crept up the stairs with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. She stood in the doorway of the master bedroom, looking at the man she had once called the love of her life, and the woman she believed had stolen everything from her. She pulled the trigger 5 times. Linda was struck twice in the chest and head. She died instantly. Dan was hit once in the chest. He managed to reach for the phone, but Betty yanked the cord from the wall. He blotted out on the floor. Betty fled the house and called her daughter, confessing what she had done. The shock that rippled through the community was immediate and profound. A woman like Betty Broderick wasn't supposed to be a killer. She wore pearls, raised 4 children, sent holiday cards. She wasn't the face of crime, but in that moment, she became a national obsession. Her arrest sparked immediate media attention. The tabloids devoured the story. News segments were aired around the clock. The narrative quickly split into 2 camps. One saw Betty as a cold-blooded murderer who had plotted an execution. The other saw her as a tragic figure, a discarded wife who had been emotionally battered until she broke. Betty's first trial began in 1990. The courtroom was packed every day. Reporters, legal experts, ordinary citizens. Betty wore tailored suits, her hair perfectly done, her expression somewhere between sorrow and smoldering anger. She testified in her own defense, recounting the years of betrayal, legal entrapment, and public humiliation. She insisted she never intended to kill anyone, that she had just wanted to confront them, to make them listen. She claimed the gun went off by accident during a heated exchange. But the facts told a different story. She had brought the gun. She had pulled the trigger 5 times. She had unplugged the phone. She had left them to die. The jury in the first trial deadlocked. 10 voted for conviction, 2 for acquittal. A mistrial was declared. Public interest in the case only intensified. Talk shows debated the morality of Betty's actions. Letters poured into the courthouse from women who identified with her pain. Hollywood producers circled the story like vultures. The second trial was held in 1991. This time, the prosecution leaned harder into the premeditation. They showed how Betty had stolen the key, hidden the gun, and written journal entries fantasizing about revenge. They showed the answering machine tapes, hours of venomous voicemails that painted Betty as both emotionally fragile and deeply vengeful. This time, the jury found her guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to 32 years to life in prison. Betty sat silently as the verdict was read, her face unreadable. She had lost Dan, lost her children, lost her freedom. But in some ways it was the only ending she ever believed was possible. In prison, Betty continued to attract media attention. She gave interviews to major networks, often doubling down on her belief that she had been driven to the edge. She insisted that Dan had emotionally abused her, that the legal system had silenced her voice, and that society had punished her for being too emotional, too reactive, too human. She rarely, if ever, expressed remorse. Her 4 children grew up carrying the weight of her actions. 2 of them advocated for her release, saying she had served enough time and was no longer a threat. The other 2 believed she should never walk free again. They loved their father and could not forgive the woman who took him from them. Betty was denied parole in 2010, 2011, and again in 2017. Each time, she told the board she felt justified in her actions. Each time, the board told her she lacked insight, lacked remorse. She remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women, waiting for another chance at freedom. Her story has been retold in books, movies, and TV shows. The second season of Dirty John dramatized her case, reigniting public fascination. But beyond the headlines and ratings, Betty Broderick's story remains a haunting cautionary tale. A story about how love can curdle into resentment, how loyalty can become a prison, how the American dream can collapse into a nightmare. To some, she is a symbol of feminine rage, a woman pushed too far in a world that discarded her. To others, she is a calculating murderer who robbed two people of their lives in cold blood. But one truth is undeniable: what happened in that bedroom on November 5, 1989. It was not a crime of passion. It was the brutal crescendo of years of pain, powerlessness, and unresolved grief. And once that line was crossed, there was no coming back.